Oh yeah. You know, I was gonna say that. Like, oh really? Were they? Yeah. Yeah, I was the one. What was the art kid line? Wait, so you're in your times, right? For wire cutter. Oh, okay. Is wire cutter part of like
Hello. Good evening, everyone. I can't get over the fact that we're in person and I can see you all and not through this. But also hi to everyone on YouTube. You're remote, we're here, we're all good. Thank you for coming tonight. This is our first, well, not the first in-person back, but the first of the fall. So welcome back to the Herb Lubalin Lecture Series. My name is Alexander. Everyone calls me Sasha. I'm one of the instructors in the Type program. It's so amazing to have you all with us to kickstart the fall of 2022 lecture series. The lecture series is part of the extended program, which is the graduate certificate program in typeface design here at Cooper Union. And the lecture series is presented by the Herb Lubalin Study Center, which is right across the hall there, and Cooper Union and Type Cooper jointly. So the lectures are generously sponsored by Type Culture, which I thank Type Culture for allowing us to continue to record the lectures and to continue to add to this amazing archive. So Type Cooper goes back to 2010. So you do the math, I can't do the math. 13. This is our 13th year. So we have 12 lectures every year since 2010, so we have a lot of lectures back there in the catalog, and they're all available. You can watch them back. Type Culture is allowing us to keep adding to them, so again, thanks to Type Culture. If you wanted to see the past lectures, you could just go to CooperType/lectures, or you can go to the Vimeo dedicated section for Cooper Type. You'll see a lot of things there. You'll see the lectures for the series. You'll also see lectures for typographics. So it's another big event that we do every summer. So check those out. Some housekeeping stuff. We have more lectures coming up. The next talk is going to be on Monday, November 7th. That's a fully remote online talk. It's going to be over a Zoom webinar. So same way to sign up for this. You can sign up for that. You'll get a Zoom link. It's going to be an afternoon talk. We're trying to kind of balance things. We have a big audience overseas now. So doing like an afternoon talk allows more people to see us in other places in the world. So David Shields is going to be with us remotely, talking about his work with the Rob Roy Kelly collection. So super interesting look at the history of 19th century American wood type and how cataloging that sort of opens up ideas. The next in-person talk and Zoom, I should say, and YouTube will be Paulina Goss for November 14th, same time as this, 6:30. She's going to talk about the Futimas, the famous, or maybe should be more famous, art school in Soviet Union in the 1920s. There is a concurrent exhibition that unfortunately got delayed. It would have been like a double header kind of thing. The exhibition would have been across the street in the in the architecture school of Futimas, the pedagogy of architecture of Futimas, and we would have like a typography talk. That exhibition is still coming. This will be delayed a little bit, so you'll have kind of a preview of some of that, and then you'll be able to come back and see that show in a few months. And the talk that will close out the lecture series will be James Clough. Will be presenting from Italy, talking about the notes on the history of writing as it's influenced typography, so the relationship of the hand and handwriting throughout history. So it should be a very fun talk. That's all remote. And that's a typo. That's 12:30, not 6:30. 6:30 in Italy would be pretty late. As always, you can register for all these talks. They're free, they're amazing. So there's the QR code. You can just look this up and find us there. Without further ado, I'm going to introduce today's presenter, Nick Sherman. Nick is a very good friend of us. He's a good friend of the Lubalin Center. He is an all-around amazing person. He's incredibly erudite. He's encyclopedic. But above all, I'd say he's a very, very generous person with everything he knows, which includes many things, including skateboarding, pizza, printing, history, printing in general, music, classic horror films. So if you ever want to talk to him about any of these subjects, chat him up after the talk online. He's incredibly easy to talk. More officially, Nick Sherman is a typographer. He's a web designer, a typeface designer, and typographic consultant. He runs Hex projects. He'll talk a little bit about that in today's talk, a company that makes fonts and websites. He's a founder and designer of Fonts in Use, which is the most amazing tool out there, one of the best. And he also runs V-Fonts, which is focused on variable fonts, v-fonts.com. Check it out if you're not familiar. Nick has worked at the Font Bureau, WebType, MyFont. He graduated with honors from the graphic design program at Mass Arts in Boston. He's originally from Cape Cod and Boston. He is also the graduate of Type Cooper's inaugural extended class from 2010. So it's incredible to have Nick come back in our 13th year to start the program kind of the way it began 13 years ago. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Nick. Enjoy the talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and thanks for coming out on this rainy night. I'm going to be interested to see how long this talk runs because I have a lot of stuff to show, but I'll try to keep a steady pace. I do want to thank Sasha and Kara and Type Cooper, the Lubalin Center, Cooper Union for having me. As Sasha mentioned, I went through the Type Cooper program the first year that they had it. Actually, I helped them a little bit to set up the program, and now I'm still involved and helping with the typographics conference and festival, and so it's really all the talks that are coming up I'm really excited about, so it's kind of an honor for me to be on the same list of talks as everyone else. So let's get into it here. As Sasha mentioned, I run a company called Hex Projects, where I make fonts and websites. Right now, the website mostly is just showing fonts. There's a lot of fonts that are not 100% complete. Some of them you can buy from Future Fonts. Some of them, if you want to use them, you can write me an email. I'm always happy to have excuses to keep working on the fonts. Also, as Sasha mentioned, I'm a co-founder of Fonts in Use. Actually, I'm curious, maybe a quick raise of hands, how many people have been to Fonts in Use before? That's a lot of people. That's more than I thought. Well, just as I was leaving my house, I looked at Fonts in Use, as I do every half hour or so, and I saw that my colleagues there have been dumping a whole bunch of Franklin Gothic content on the homepage, so check it out after this is done. If you're not familiar with Fonts in Use, it's a place where we catalog examples of fonts in use. Everything from old baseball cards, to movie posters, to websites, to digital apps, anything that uses a font, which is almost all graphic design. And it's cataloged by topics and with tags about the style of the typography and information about whatever the thing is. Of course, there's also a lot of information there about the fonts themselves. I think this is maybe one of the underappreciated aspects of the site because it has historical info, but also links to other related typefaces, either typefaces that kind of have a similar style or historically related, with links out to specimens and places to buy the fonts. Again, I've been working with Cooper Union on the typographics program every year. I'll talk about this a little bit more, the last year's website specifically, but a quick summary is that so far every year I've been building the website and doing a lot of the design work on my own with some help from other students and my colleague Mark, who's working here at Cooper Union. And Sasha, of course, is giving input, Kara. It's a really great experience. If you've never been to typographics, check it out. So to the topic at hand, this quote is where I got the title of this talk. It comes from a guy named Steve Watts, who was the Type Foundry supervisor at the American Type Founders Company. He worked there from 1919 until 1955, so quite a long time. And basically what he's saying is Franklin Gothic is kind of an indestructible typeface. It's come and gone through different trends and different periods of time and fashion, but it still keeps on going. People keep using it in different and interesting ways. Excuse me. But you might be asking, what exactly does Franklin Gothic mean? Because it's so close to Halloween, we originally had this talk scheduled on Halloween, and I was joking that I should come dressed up like this Franklin Gothic meme. A Ben Franklin with some goth makeup on it. But I opted to move it up a little, so unfortunately you don't get to see me in Gothic. The Franklin in Franklin Gothic, though, does refer to Benjamin Franklin, who, other than being a politician, was a printer. His brother founded one of the earliest newspapers in America, and Ben Franklin worked there setting type. He later ran his own presses. He had correspondence with Baskerville about his types. So he was very much in the world of printing and typography. He was also one of the people who was essentially sent on a press check when they printed the first version of the Declaration of Independence, which is called the Dunlap Broadside. Just a fun little fact. So that's the Franklin part. Gothic is a little more mysterious. As far as I can tell, the term Gothic was first used to describe a typeface to basically mean sans serif in 1837, I think it was, from the Boston Type Foundry. This is the typeface in question. It's just called Gothic, and you can see it has the different sizes for each of the kind of sets of metal type. And you'll also notice that the differences between the sizes are slightly different because they were all cut by hand at that exact size. We'll get into that again later. But basically, that, as far as I know, that's the first time the term Gothic was used for describing a sans serif typeface. And that's Franklin Gothic comes from that tradition of sans serifs. It was first released at the turn of the 20th century, in 1902, with just a handful of styles, and it never really grew to many more than a handful of styles. Well, there are some exceptions, we'll get into that later, but essentially there was the normal width, the condensed, and the extra condensed, and that's kind of the core of the Franklin Gothic type family. There are no named weights from the original release from the American Type Founders Company, but there are other related typefaces. Since this is so close to Halloween now, I did want to do some Halloween-y stuff. So I've kind of organized this talk according to this easy-to-follow photo guide from a cool magazine I have. It's all about doing your own monster makeup. I always really like this kid on the cover. And so this is, in some ways, this is how I'm going to explain my love affair with Franklin Gothic and how it's gradually grown and turned me into a kind of a weirdo Franklin Gothic monster. And so let's start at the beginning here. With when I first noticed Franklin Gothic, or even how I came to first notice it. When I was growing up in Massachusetts in the 1990s, I was a little punk rocker. This is when I was 11 or 12. You can't see here, but my arm's broken from a skateboarding accident. It's kind of like pinned in my jacket there. So I was, yeah, listening to punk music, skateboarding, and I don't know if I really even realized it at the time, but a lot of my favorite records, when I was very impressionable and just learning about punk rock music, were using Franklin Gothic and using it quite prominently. And it's almost surprising how consistent this is for a number of albums. This is the first Ramones record from 1976, probably designed by Arturo Vega, who was kind of the fifth Ramone. He was the art director for the Ramones for decades. And this album in particular, I think it must have really kind of flipped a switch in my brain because it's one of my favorite albums of all time. And this typeface, which is Franklin Gothic extra condensed, became one of my favorite typefaces of all time. This might actually be just condensed. This is for the first EP from Minor Threat. It's probably designed by Jeff Nelson, who was a member of the band, but they also used it on other albums, like the Complete Discography, which is where I first encountered it. I'm pretty sure this was set with Letraset type. I'll talk about that in a little bit. But from the same record label, there was this compilation called Flex Your Head that came out in 1982. And this is the back cover of it. And I always really loved the design at the time, and I never really understood why, but I'm pretty sure it was because of this extra condensed Franklin Gothic and the kind of like off-kilter, not fully mechanical typesetting of it. Also, it's a great album. Similarly, these are all kind of in the same era of early 1980s, 1982. The Descendants, also very, I wouldn't say life-changing, but I guess in some ways life-changing. It kind of changed my ideas about what punk rock was and could be. And then similarly, more locally, there was this band called the FUs from Boston. And I think I mostly liked the illustration on this, which is from an illustrator named Pusthead. But still, it's got some Franklin Gothic, so I had to throw it in the talk. I could keep going on and on. I'll just do a couple more here. This one is Band Infest. This is more late 80s, 1988. I discovered Infest much later, but they still took a hold on me. This album, again, it just used Franklin Gothic so prominently I had to throw it in the mix here. But one thing I wanted to talk a little bit more about was this idea of kind of DIY production techniques, and specifically rub-down lettering. This is a Letraset sheet, and if you're not familiar with it, the way it works is essentially you put the sheet of letters over a piece of paper and you rub it down, and one of the letters will transfer onto the paper, and then you move the sheet and repeat. And that's probably how a good number of these examples were first applied. I was using similar kind of techniques, photocopiers, even my mom's typewriter that she had for work. This is a tape cover for one of my first bands called The Monsters. I think I was 12 years old or something when I made this. And I remember kind of sitting at my mom's work and trying to figure out how to print on two sides of a piece of paper and make it line up. And that's something I still struggle with today. But as you can see, it's very lo-fi. When I look at it now, it looks like something that was intentionally messed up to make it look more punk, but I assure you that I was trying to make it as clean as I possibly could. This one I was pretty proud of. The labels for that tape, we wanted them to be orange, and actually this tape was released. It was, I think, the anniversary of the release of this will be tomorrow. I'm not even going to try to think of how many years ago that was, but we wanted orange stickers on the tape, but we didn't have orange paper, so we spray painted it, and every single tape was typed on a typewriter by hand. So it's very, very lo-fi. Of course, when you're a band, you have to start making merch and other kinds of graphic products. So, of course, I was making flyers. This was probably also when I was about 13 or maybe 14. Yeah, again, just lo-fi, like cutting out logos of bands that I have like a sticker from and using it, otherwise drawing it by hand. It's kind of amazing how much things have changed now. Of course, trying to be as provocative as possible. This was one of the bigger shows that we played, but these shows are all happening at like small VFW halls, organized by either our friends or sometimes our friends' moms, or even our own moms, because the VFW hall wouldn't let us rent out the hall, you know, as some 13-year-old punk rocker kid. I can't say that I would rent the hall out to that kid with the spiky blonde hair either. But actually, the production technique that kind of sent me down a real rabbit hole with Franklin Gothic wasn't lecture set, it was these vinyl adhesive stickers. And I don't know if you've ever used these before, but it's pretty self-explanatory. You peel off the letter and you stick them down. And so, of course, I was making tapes, and when you're only producing like 10 or 15 tapes for your friends, it's not a problem to stick them all down by hand and use just like, you know, the generic blank tape that you get at CVS or whatever. But this was right around the time where I started going to graphic arts high school. It was a technical high school, and I was in the graphic arts department. And there was something Franklin related there that actually wasn't part of my graphic arts training, but it was in my science class. They played this movie, Powers of 10, which if you haven't watched it, it's really cool. It's made by Ray and Charles Eames, and the general idea is it zooms way out on the Earth and then zooms way back in and talks about all the stuff you're seeing along the way. But all the titling, at least in the beginning and the end of the film, is set in all caps, condensed Franklin. And this is really when, like, not only just Franklin Gothic, but specifically extra condensed Franklin Gothic kind of took hold in my brain. These are a little bit later, like I actually found these on an old hard drive and was astounded. This is, again, from high school. I never thought I would see this little, as you can see, it's very pixelated because I had to make them that small when I was emailing them in 2001 or 2000, whenever this was. But again, Franklin Gothic condensed, more flyers. This is now, I've kind of, since I was at this graphic arts program in high school, I started learning to use computer, and of course Franklin Gothic there. And then if you want to get really advanced, I started making some plain letters, Franklin Gothic. I was quite proud of myself. This, I think, was my second year of high school. I'm now probably boring you with all my personal stories about Franklin Gothic, but the last one I want to mention is just this other band that I was in called 8-Bit that was later in high school, and it's kind of a return back after I'd been using the computer for a while. I discovered that they had a wax roller at my high school, and I really got into cutting things out with wax and using, I did use Letraset for the logo, and kind of doing it all manually with paste up that way. But as I mentioned, kind of Franklin Gothic had seeped into my blood by this point, so I started seeing it everywhere I went, and this has not changed. It's only gotten quite worse. You'll see it in full force as we go through this talk. But that's now complete step one of the process of becoming a Franklin Gothic monster. So once you start being interested in anything, of course you want to learn more about it. The same was true with all my music and my skateboarding and, of course, design. So when I was in college, going to a graphic design program at MassArt, and then also later after college just doing my own research, I wanted to learn more about Franklin Gothic and where it came from, and like what's the deal? Why is it that sometimes it looks good and I like the way it looks and sometimes it doesn't? And I'm not going to pretend as though this is a very linear story of how I learned things, but it's just how I organized it to explain a short history to you. I could do an entire talk on all the typefaces that came before Franklin Gothic that are somehow related or predecessor. But just suffice to say that in 1892, there were 30-something type foundries in the United States, and at some point they all decided, probably egged on with the competition from the new linotype machine, that they had to band together and become kind of a cohesive effort. And that's what they did in 1892. 23 foundries merged into what was then the largest, and probably still the largest and most advanced type foundry at the time. Later, other large foundries that were kind of holdouts eventually merged into it too, and it was quite a large operation. And some of the main people behind this were the Bentons. So this is Lynn Boyd Benton on the left, who was the director of ATF. He designed the Century typeface. I don't know if you're familiar with that. But he was also an engineer, and he invented a machine that essentially allowed people to cut typefaces at different sizes with a machine using a pattern instead of doing it all by hand, which definitely helped clean up a lot of the irregularities that you would see in older sans serif typefaces, or just typefaces in general. The guy on the right is his son. His name is Morris Fuller Benton. He's kind of a personal hero of mine, if for no other reason than he designed Franklin Gothic. But so his job at ATF was to essentially, as you can imagine, when you have 23 or more foundries all merging into one, they have a lot of redundant typefaces in their catalog. And so it was up to Morris Fuller Benton to go through everything and pick what got to stay, what got to go. Sometimes different type families were merged into one type family if they were similar enough, which wasn't uncommon back then. And then he also was in charge of essentially designing new typefaces using the technology that his dad had invented and trying to meet the demands of the market at the time. So yeah, when ATF became a company in 1892, they put out a specimen from all the different type companies that were part of ATF then, and there was something like 40 or 50 different sans serif families that were probably largely overlapping in style. There's a lot more I could say about these two guys, but they're really interesting. There's a book, if you're interested to learn more, from Patricia Cost that I would recommend. It's interesting both for type history, but also history of engineering and just kind of industry in the United States. And so one of the typefaces that Morris Fuller Benton, as I mentioned, produced in his job was Franklin Gothic. And at the time it was really kind of a pinnacle, I think, of all the previous sans serif typefaces that other companies have been working on, kind of on and off and in small chunks. There's a guy named Mac McGrew who wrote this book called American Metal Typefaces of the 20th Century, and he said Franklin Gothic might be the patriarch of modern American Gothics. And we'll talk a little bit about why that is. But first of all, let's kind of take a very close look at characteristic glyphs of Franklin Gothic. These four glyphs here hold a lot of the DNA that kind of carries throughout the rest of the design. So you see, compared to a lot of other sans serif typefaces like Futura or a lot of the more modernist typefaces that came a little bit later, there's kind of a slight contrast between the thick parts of the letters and the thin parts of the letters. You also notice that the terminal, you can see my mouse here or not, at the end of the E is not, it doesn't come all the way up to be at a right angle. It's kind of at a non-orthogonal angle. And that carries out throughout the rest of the typeface as well. But probably the thing that, in my opinion, is really the core of the DNA of Franklin Gothic is the way that the curved arches meet into the stem. Wish I had a laser pointer or something so I could point it out here, but can you see the mouse? No. But basically where the curve comes out of the stem of the H or out of the P, it's not a smooth connection. It comes out straight. And it's like, I call it a stab connection. I don't know if that's an actual legitimate term or not, but and if you kind of look at other glyphs in other styles and widths, you can see some of this DNA kind of percolating out. There's also some very characteristic glyphs, like the lowercase g has kind of an ear, looks like a little waggy dog ear or something. But you also notice that as the design gets more condensed, those angled terminals that we saw in the C before start to become more horizontal with the baseline. Another interesting thing about Franklin Gothic is the C, both the uppercase and lowercase, are slightly top-heavy. So the top part, it ends in a thicker stroke than on the bottom, which is fairly unusual. Usually they're either about the same or sometimes slightly lighter. But again, the contrast carries through. There's thick parts and thin parts, and kind of modulation in the width of the stroke, regardless of the width. So I mentioned before that there were the three kind of core styles of Franklin Gothic, but actually there are a handful more. Later on, a wide variant was added. There was an italic pretty early on, and then a condensed italic came in the 50s. But this is pretty much the family here. There's also like some kind of ornamented variants that have stripes in it, or outline, drop shadow, whatever else. But this is pretty much it, which is kind of impressive when you think of how popular Franklin Gothic is. But part of the reason that is that Franklin Gothic isn't just a family on its own. ATF themselves marketed Franklin Gothic as part of the ATF Gothic family. So you can see here there's also News Gothic, Alternate Gothic, Monotone Gothic, Lightline Gothic, and these created kind of an ad hoc extended family of typefaces that were either intended to work well together or just happened to work quite well together. So you can, here's another kind of visualization of this. This table is a little weird because the headings sometimes are content and sometimes not, but it shows all the styles. I think the only style that's missing here that really matters is the condensed italic. But you can see kind of how all these different typefaces, even though they have different names, they have kind of a similar underlying structure or design aesthetic. As Mac McGrew said, this group of typefaces, which ATF called the ATF Gothic family, a lot of them are more similar than some of the other typefaces I talked about, especially the kind of early typefaces where each size was being cut by hand, and there were a lot of irregularities between sizes and different styles. Because ATF was using this machine that helped to keep things consistent, it really helped to also keep the larger family of typefaces consistent. Probably the least similar to Franklin Gothic, though still pretty similar, is Alternate Gothic. One thing I should have noted, let's go back and look at Franklin Gothic again. You'll notice that unlike a lot of sans serif typefaces, when the round glyphs get narrow, so the C, the G, the O, the sides of the glyphs still remain round. They don't become straight. But that is the case with alternate Gothic. You'll see like the D or the O or the C, when they kind of reach a certain point, they go straight for a while and then start curving again. So this makes it a little, that's the most noticeable difference from Franklin Gothic. Otherwise, there's a lot of kind of similar, contrast and style in general. Things start getting a little more interesting when you look at the very light members of this extended ATF Gothic family, and specifically Lightline. To my eye, Lightline looks basically just like condensed Franklin Gothic, but very light. There are subtle differences, like the middle of the M doesn't reach all the way down to the baseline, but other than that, it looks almost like the skeleton version of Franklin Gothic. Monotone Gothic a little less so. It's slightly wide, tightly spaced, and we'll talk a little bit about why that might be coming up. But really, the sibling that's closest to Franklin Gothic in this extended family is News Gothic. And this is something that I had been aware of for a long time. I think even in my college classes, we had been taught that Franklin Gothic's lighter weight sibling was News Gothic. And I figured, they're from the same foundry, they have the same designer, of course they're going to have some similar DNA. But I never really looked too close at it. And as far as I can tell, a lot of people have not looked very close at this relationship, because even in reading kind of scholarly articles about Franklin Gothic, I'll see News Gothic only mentioned kind of in passing. But when you really get them large and up next to each other, you can really start to see the similarities, the same kind of structure, especially in the more characteristic glyphs like the G or the Q or the R, and especially when you get into the lowercase. To me, again, it's almost like a skeleton version of Franklin Gothic. So I have these scans are from this box of cards I have that show all the glyphs from a bunch of different ATF typefaces. And I was like, well, how similar are these really, like if I overlaid them? So that's exactly what I did. And I had to nudge things around a little bit to get each glyph kind of centered with the corresponding glyph in the other style. But what you're seeing here basically is that News Gothic is in red, Gothic is in blue, and the differences in weight are very consistent from glyph to glyph. It looks almost like in the uppercase they're trying to match the width of the glyphs exactly in many cases. And if it was just one or two glyphs that matched dead on, I would say, okay, that's a coincidence. But when you look at it like this, it seems like it was a very intentional kind of reversal of weight to get at what became News Gothic. Same in the lowercase. Of course, there are some glyphs that you can't just remove weight from all the way around and expect them to function properly. But when I saw this is when I really started thinking about how this might kind of play out in a kind of more modernized way. But before we get to that, that's much later in the talk. I should also mention that there were many different versions of Franklin Gothic, even kind of in the pre-digital and pre-phototype era. This is Ludlow's version of Franklin Gothic. And I like to use this as an example of, and actually the next example is even better, but a lot of times there's a confusion between what a font is and what a typeface is, and a lot of times it really doesn't matter, to be honest. But this is an example where if you look at the R from Ludlow's Franklin Gothic. It's much different than the R, and I probably should have just had one ready to go. But if it doesn't look different to you, just trust me that it's quite different. We might, actually, I think in this slide, you can see it here. This is the Ludlow R, and then the normal R is up here. The leg kind of attaches much closer to the main upright stem. So that was just another company that had a different typesetting technology that probably licensed the rights to make their own version of Franklin Gothic. And this was very common in the era of letterpress printing. One example I really like, because it's so bad, is this one from the Hamilton Wood Type Company. I'm a little reluctant to talk trash on the Hamilton Wood Type Company because I have a relationship now with what is the Hamilton Wood Type Museum in Two Rivers, Wisconsin. But if you look at a lot of their mid-20th century adaptations of popular typefaces for wood, you start seeing, especially when you look really close, the curves are just look like they were cut with a hacksaw. You also notice like the C is kind of curving in on itself, which is more of a British thing. Same with the S. There's a lot going on here, and I'm not going to go through it all, but it just goes to show that sometimes a different font of the same typeface can mean the difference between getting something that looks nice and something that does not look nice. Another company that had a lot of versions of Franklin Gothic was this company that was based here in New York called Photo Lettering Incorporated. And they basically had a photographic typesetting process where you would order a headline from them and they would typeset it with their extremely large catalog of different type styles, or alphabets as they called them. And they had dozens of different variants of Franklin Gothic, and they were coming from different places. Some were designed by different people. Some of them were part of like a sub-series. Some of them had numbers, like there was, let me see here, Franconia, Bartuska Franklin Gothic 10, Pete Don Franklin Gothic. There's a lot of them, and this is just one page of many. If you've ever seen a photo lettering catalog, it's kind of overwhelming because there's just so much stuff to look at. If you ever get a chance to go to Lubalin Center and have a peek at one of these, if you haven't already. So they were making a lot of different Franklin kind of variants, and they even had kind of a subset called Franklin Graphic, which was a more cohesive set with numbers for the different weights that were much more finely tuned. Like between one number and the next, it would be just a slight difference. They even used Franklin Gothic in some of their marketing material. This is a little specimen book I have, and I just love the design of this. This was designed by Ed Benguet. But something I want to point out here and to keep an eye out for in the future is this lowercase g in big, and how the kind of ear on that is really even more exaggerated than in the original Franklin Gothic that we were looking at earlier. So just keep that in mind as we go forward. But so this is where my Franklin Gothic monster urges really, I was like starting to shapeshift, because I decided I would make a spreadsheet of all the different Franklin Gothic variants that photo lettering has. And there are different catalogs with all the information about page numbers, and they have codes for, you know, if it's an original design, or if they have a miniature showing of it in the back of one of their books, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not going to show you all of that, but, and this is just the Franklin Gothic related things that I looked at in their book. They also have just as many News Gothic interpretations, and in fact, a lot of their News Gothic interpretations, this is from volume 2 of their big catalog, has these little tiny showings of the alphabets in the back, including the alternate glyphs that they have for that alphabet. So you can see in this, there's 2 different capital S's, there's at least 2 different lowercase a's, 2 F's, a lot of the alternates are made to make the typeface look a little bit more kind of Helvetica-ish. The terminals end up being more upright than at an angle. So there's still a lot more of Franklin Gothic and News Gothic and the whole ATF Gothic family that I know is out there, and I've been trying to hold off digging into it, but this talk hasn't helped me very much. Up until today, I was still making scans of books and things like that. In the digital era, this is probably the version of Franklin Gothic that I first used as a digital font. It was digitized by the Linotype company, which is a whole other story about why that is. But something I always took for granted was that for some reason in this version, Franklin Gothic is referred to as Franklin Gothic number 2, but all the condensed and extra condensed styles are just normal Franklin Gothic. And it wasn't until actually I started thinking about putting together info for this talk that I became curious about where that even came from. So I emailed all kinds of people who are smarter than me and know more about the American Type Founding Company. And it was even Patricia Cost, who wrote the book about the Bentons that I told you about before, Matthew Carter, Frank Romano, a lot of kind of type historians that I would hope, I had hoped would know, who kind of had suggestions but weren't quite sure. And then a friend of mine, Paul Shaw, mentioned that it might have something to do with a practice that they used at ATF for using numbers for different kind of variants, similar to alternate Gothic, which I showed you earlier. So I started looking at if that was the case, and that was not the case. But then I found this 1987 catalog from the Mergenthaler Type Library, the digital typeface directory. And these two samples were shown next to each other. And I can't tell you how long I just stared at them saying, what's going on? Actually, I'm curious if anyone here who hasn't already seen something that I wrote about this can point out the things. If you can, I'll give you a free Franklin Gothic font. I couldn't figure it out until basically I made the scan and overlaid them, and you can just barely see it. And basically, the descenders for the P and the G and the J and the Y are slightly higher than the other ones. And that seems to be the answer, just slightly shorter descenders. Except for some reason the Q has the same length descender. I think that must be an error. And then also the 1 has like a slight difference in the flag of the 1. Yeah, and you can barely even see it on the slides here. But so this is like, I'm really starting to get into the rabbit hole here. But it only gets deeper. Whoa. We're like not even halfway through here. The next big kind of shift historically in the timeline of Franklin Gothic comes from a company called ITC. And it stands for International Typeface Corporation. Probably if you've used fonts, you've heard of ITC Garamond or ITC this, ITC that. ITC was a company also founded here in New York by some of the people that also were involved with photo lettering. So there's kind of a lot of crossover. But they were known for kind of changing the way that type designers were compensated for their work. Instead of getting a one-time payment for a design that you did, you could get royalties from a font. So if your font starts going gangbusters and ITC is selling 1 million copies, then you benefit from that. And that's really changed the way the type industry worked quite a bit. Unfortunately, and somewhat ironically, ITC has now kind of been put into zombie mode and is run by a company that doesn't offer royalties for designers anymore, as far as I know. Anyways, ITC was very cool at the time. If you were a young graphic designer, you loved using ITC fonts in the 70s. the 80s because they were slightly funkier, or the people that were working on them a lot of times were lettering artists that had worked for photo lettering. So the designs were solid, but they were also interesting and new and better than just like whatever was in the metal type cabinet that you've been used to using for all of your career up until that point. They also changed a bit the idea. A lot of times typefaces were designed for a specific typesetting technology, but ITC made it kind of a core part of their business that they would sell the design and the artwork for the typeface, and then it was up to the company to turn that artwork into the machinery needed to do typesetting. Oh, I lost the slide. I probably should have plugged my computer in. That's what I planned to use. Oh, that's up here somewhere. Up over here. There's a remote. Because I hadn't advanced the slide for a while, blabbing away too long. There we go. But one of the typical approaches that ITC took for a typeface design was to essentially take an existing historical typeface that had already proven itself popular and do their own kind of spin on it, modernize it. They were almost infamous for using extremely large X heights. So all the lowercase letters were much larger than they would have been in the original design. And you can see it's kind of got more of like a 70s funky vibe than this older historical typeface. It looks a little bit less dusty, especially in the context of the 1970s or early 1980s. And so inevitably they got around to doing this with Franklin Gothic. This is the March issue of 1980 for their promotional publication, which was called UNLC. And this, I think UNLC was one of the big drivers of the popularity of ITC. It was basically they were publishing all kinds of cool articles about new fonts, and the articles were all designed by really good designers. I think this cover was designed by Herb Lubalin. And this is announcing their new version of ITC Franklin Gothic. But you can see actually the kind of mentality of bringing in designers from the world of photo lettering to design these layouts. Some of the glyphs are slightly changed, like you'll see in dissertation, the E is slightly narrower, probably to make space so that they can justify the whole line. So there's a lot of like minute trickery going on to get this solid block of text. But this style of spacing is very much in the wheelhouse of ITC and UNLC, and basically the style at the time. ITC Franklin was a new idea because it introduced, for the first time, a lighter weight version of Franklin that had the name Franklin. So that there were 4 weights originally, and then they each had italic, and then I think there was also a handful of kind of decorative styles, outline, shadow, stuff like that. But when you look at kind of the overall feeling of the typeface, it's a little more subtle than maybe the cobble example that I showed earlier, but it's definitely a slightly different flavor than the kind of old school original Franklin Gothic. And when you really start looking at why that is, you zoom in close, you'll see that the connections that I was talking about, where the curve comes out from the stem, it's no longer kind of a stab coming out. It's more of a smooth connection, which is more how Helvetica worked. Of course, Helvetica was hugely popular at the time, as it always is. So this probably helped with the popularity of ITC Franklin Gothic when it first came out. And I agree, it looks slightly kind of smoothed over. The angles, like on the lowercase e, aren't as, the terminals aren't as angled. They're almost all the way upright. So it's been slightly like Helvetica-ized and smoothed over. And I don't necessarily think that it's bad, but to me, it's not that it doesn't have, it's kind of lost some of that Franklin sauce, so to speak. And here again is that G that I told you to keep in the back of your mind. Now, I don't know if the designer of ITC Franklin Gothic, who is Victor Caruso, I think you pronounce his name, I don't know if he was involved in any of the photo lettering versions of Franklin Gothic, but it seems that they've kind of adopted this very exaggerated, goofy ear on the E. And this will come up again over and over throughout history of Franklin Gothic now after ITC. Paul Shaw wrote a review of ITC Franklin Gothic in a column he had called Flawed Typefaces, or Imprint, in 2010, May 2010, basically saying that this G is really kind of getting in the way and starting to be distracting, especially graphic text, which you now, I mean, there is one of the styles is called ITC Franklin Gothic book, so they can set this for kind of long pages of text. If we look at kind of a side-by-side comparison, the original version, or digital version of the original, and ITC Franklin Gothic, you can see that the differences are subtle. Probably most people who aren't graphic designers, they were looking at the two Franklin Gothics earlier, but you can see the weight is slightly heavier. There's a lighter weight, but then it's slightly lighter. So there isn't a style that matches the weight dead on. Again, the curves coming out of the stems are no longer kind of stabbing into them. It's a smooth connection. And also kind of, I don't know how to describe this, but if you look at the lowercase h, it almost looks like it's more of a round top than a kind of asymmetrical top. The lowercase a of ITC Franklin Gothic always kind of annoyed me. I can't say why, but and then again, there's that goofy. The original Franklin Gothic, that ear is, I mean, to me it seems very characteristic, but when you see it in ITC Franklin Gothic, it really starts to scream. Again, the E, the terminal is closer to being completely horizontal. And I think overall it's just, in some ways it feels like a caricature of Franklin Gothic, but not. It's like if you fused Franklin Gothic with Helvetica and then cranked it up to 10, that's what you get. So this was released in 1980, but later on, David Berlow, I think in 1991, added condensed and compressed and extra compressed widths, and they released this through the Font Bureau Foundry. They also introduced these kind of unicase variants that's like a lowercase letter at capital height. And while this definitely makes the family more versatile as far as weights and widths and functionality, there are still some things about it that make it a little tricky to use. And I know this because I used it now almost 10 years ago when Jessica Hish and I worked together on remaking the Type Directors Club website, and we were using ITC Franklin. And it did most of what we needed, but I kept running into certain, it wasn't even necessarily that I was running into things, it was that I wanted something and it wasn't there, or the weight that I wanted was like the options, one was either too heavy or too light, and sometimes things are just a little bit weird. for this example, kind of the traditional Franklin Gothic extra condensed, which I think is great. That's like that's the style that really does it for me. But in ITC Franklin, I feel like the weight is slightly too chunky. The cross is a little high. E doesn't close in quite as much. Some of the glyphs close in more than others. I don't want to be like talking trash on David Burlow's work. He's been working at this way longer than I have. But I can say as a type user that these were things that I kept bumping into. So there's some validity to them. Another issue with it was the weight for text. So I should say that when ITC Franklin was released, this kind of expansion, the name was changed from ITC different. But with ITC Franklin and also with for normal text. And so it works, and you can definitely do what you need to with ITC Franklin, but after using it for a long time with the Type Directors Club, I kept wanting for more. We're kind of entering a chapter where I'm going to talk not so much about the typefaces and the different variants, but just specifically about Franklin Gothic, mostly the original variant or kind of digitizations of that, and how it kind of fits in the world of graphic design and typography in general. This quote is from Christian Schwartz, who's a designer of commercial type. And this was actually a typographics conference. I forget what year, maybe one of the early ones. Was talking about Frank as being kind of this quintessential. It doesn't hurt that it's comes from the American Type Founders Company, but it's also a very uniquely and somehow popularly American thing. It definitely hasn't been as popular in Europe or other parts of the world as far as I know. But there are some people and companies use, I think, really make it sing. Kind of legendary albums. Really, Franklin Gothic and also News Gothic very heavily, very creative, interesting, and fun ways. One of my all-time favorites. Yeah, just experimenting with putting type under smashed glass, flipping it around, justifying it, having people hold it, put it in boxes. And then there was a string of time in the 60s where, I don't know if he had a font made for this or if he was doing every single one by hand, but he did a series of albums where the letters were all kind of chopped up and put together as though they're kind of like peeking out from behind a board. There's a few examples, and they're all kind of slightly different. But it's an interesting technique, and I wouldn't be surprised if he examined things, but interesting thing about Franklin Gothic is the variety of different things that it's been used for, and how kind of appropriate it can seem in such different situations. This is a a little example design that ATF made. This is 1917. This is a supplement to one of their type specimen books. And it's just so funny to read the text about Mr. American, learn to shoot, be prepared to defend your country. Of course, this is in the middle of World War I, but the design, if you told me that was from 1960, I would not second. A militarist. Franklin Gothic is specified in the official uniform and insignia standards for the U.S. Army for name badges. So if your last name is more than 11 characters or something, they have to use Franklin Gothic extra condensed, which seems kind of like arbitrary, but cool. I don't know. I like Franklin Gothic extra condensed, so. It's also been used on Department of Defense kind of medical kit packaging. I really like these survival crackers. It has this just kind of like utilitarian, no nonsense. Yeah, I don't know, it just seems like kind of funny in a way. On the flip side of the coin, it's also been used in kind of the opposite context. This is a protest poster that was made in 1968 by Billy Apple and Robert Coburn, and it's basically, you know, in the middle of the Vietnam War, protesting, probably doing it at draft card burning events and things like that. Also famously, this is one of my all-time favorite uses, Franklin Gothic, is by John Lennon and Yoko Ono for their War is Over campaign. This is started in 1969, and basically their whole idea was to sell peace as though it was a commercial product, as though they were selling soap or any other thing that you probably don't really need. And it was all over the world on huge billboards. They put leaflets everywhere, posters, and it's just so straightforward and simple. And this has been now turned into a meme, and you can probably find a million different variations that say, I know I've seen one that says like over, or I actually made one that said ITC is over with a version of Franklin Gothic I'm working on. Another power user, I would say, is Daniel Gill at Alianza Editorial. I don't really know much about this publication house, mostly because they aren't publishing in English as far as I know, but I do know about the covers because I see them from time to time in bookstores, and that they are power users of Franklin Gothic. They use it quite a bit on a lot of their and this one is interesting because it's Franklin Gothic in with kind of matching widths, and then kind of gradual transition between the different styles. And this really like flipped a switch. I started to make me about how I might make my own version of Franklin Gothic. And I found that the more I look at old stuff from good designers who know how to use type well, the more ideas I get for making changes to a typeface that will make them more useful or more interesting. Series from the and just the visual immediacy of this. Another one with some repetition here. What we call a tag on fonts in use for this technique called crop and repeat. I also got some more smashed glass, some cut, kind of grungified type. It was really interesting to me when a designer can use one type in different contexts and it still feels different in the different contexts. And I think Franklin Gothic and News Gothic are really good for that. They have just enough personality to not be completely sterile and boring, but they are mutable enough that you can put them in different contexts and they still feel like they work. So now we're gonna hit hyperspeed, and I'm just going to blast through a bunch of random examples of Franklin Gothic in use that if I had all the time in the world, I would be posting these every single day on fontsanduse.com, but I have to have a real life, so I'm just going to speed through them now, and maybe my colleagues will help me get to them eventually. Back to the point about Franklin Gothic being a very flexible typeface, this quote from Alexander Lawson, I think, is very relevant in that Franklin has been around, and a lot of Morris Benton's typefaces have been around forever. They've kind of made it through decades of different fashions, are being used in new and interesting ways. The pace here, a book that I like. It's basically a book that just has a bunch of like striped letters that you're meant to cut out and use in your like paste up design mock-ups. But the cover is just a very straight caps Franklin explanation of how to use the book and what it does, and I just love it's that's the same like no nonsense straightforward approach that I like. But also it's kind of an art film. Still looks great. I like when I should say, first of all, Franklin Gothic extra condensed and really tight spacing is like the pinnacle of Franklin Gothic existence for me. So you've probably seen a lot of that throughout these slides. It's a record I got when I was living in Amsterdam. I just like the colors. It's also sometimes interesting to see, I don't know, I have this huge file on my computer of all these images I've been saving of Franklin Gothic for, I don't know, I guess for this talk is why I've been saving it. And so now I've been able to kind of piece together a few threads of this one example on the right. I'm not sure if this weird vibration effect is something that was like offered from a phototype setting house or if it was something stuff. Again, just straightforward Franklin. Just set it all caps Franklin, extra condensed, that's all you need. This is an interesting, I've seen a couple stencil variants of Franklin Gothic, and I haven't really compared to see if they match or if it's kind of off the cuff thing the designer did, but I would be surprised if at some point lots of cool paperbacks used Franklin Gothic. Also just kind of seedy like Pulp Fiction stuff from the 60s. I really like the kind of bouncy baseline of this Vice Cop example, and I have a few other. I was thinking about making a version of Franklin Gothic that automatically would kind of bounce around like this. I think it'd be fun. This one's a small use, but it has that bouncy baseline. It's designed by Barney. I don't know, I just like how big this is and how it's kind of integrated in the photo. Push forward this idea. This one I think maybe see Franklin and normal Franklin. I can't, it's the type's a little too small to see, but again, it's got this kind of like, it reminds me a bit of some of these designs you see often with Futura bold that are like mimicking Wes Anderson movies or something, where it's kind of this utilitarian, everyday, no-nonsense labeling. And I don't know why, but this like makes me more interested than like some fine typography, expensive book. Cool New Order flyer. This is from Lawrence Weiner, who's, I wanted to put more slides from Lawrence Weiner's work. He's an artist who works a lot with text and has used Franklin Gothic quite a lot. It's Shirley Chisholm, who was the first black woman elected to Congress, and was also the first black candidate for like a major nomination for president in the U.S. She obviously didn't win for president, but I love her poster. I love her buttons. Love everything about it. All caps Franklin. extra condensed, bring it on. Again, I'm just kind of like pulling together different themed content from my file of stuff. I do want to give a special shout out to New York Magazine. This is a fairly recent issue in the past few months. And this is one of my favorite magazine covers. I guess it's probably not surprising now that you know how much I love Franklin Gothic. But something that probably most people don't appreciate is the spacing. When you use the existing digital versions of Franklin Gothic to get this kind of tight spacing where you have very regular space between clearances of each glyph, it's kind of a lot of annoying kerning work. And I think they do a really good job over there. Also, they've been using Franklin Gothic for a while at New York Magazine, and I think they always are doing cool and interesting stuff. That magazine is probably my favorite magazine just for the design alone. Check it out if you haven't. Another magazine that has used Franklin quite well is Time. They've actually used a mix of different versions of Franklin. There's another typographics talk actually where Carrie Mifsud is talking about using Franklin when she was working at Time, and she's now working at New York Times, but how she had to consult with this guy Kent Liu, who's maybe the only other person who's nerdier about Franklin Gothic, and he knows all the different digital versions from all the weird ancient digital companies and which ones have which weights and italics and things like that. But they mixed a lot of them for Time when they were still using Franklin Gothic. Quick aside for News Gothic, which, as we all know, is basically just Franklin Gothic Light. Specifically these bolder weights and tighter settings of News Gothic from Pushpin Studios and Milton Glaser and kind of that whole crew really kind of lit a fire under my butt to start thinking about making my own variant of Franklin Gothic that kind of had a News Gothic aspect built into it. This one I thought was really cool. I really loved the super tight spacing of the headline, but then I also noticed that it's promoting an event from the Cooper Union Alumni Association. So this is like some kind of psychedelic ball or something like that. I don't know, but this kind of tight lockup, I really enjoy that. And for some reason, it seems like in the 60s there was like the new bold version of News Gothic was released. I think it was in the 60s, and it was used in quite a lot of places. And there's some weird characteristics about it, like the lowercase a has kind of the overhang is a little like weird. But it was always set really tightly, maybe because it was introduced as a photo typeface. But it really, I don't know, it looks great when it's set super tight like that. It's also, the one on the left here, the accounting one, has that similar kind of no-nonsense, straightforward vibe that I enjoy. I also like the experimentation with the different quotation marks in the one on the right. I don't know what to say about this, but it's cool, so I put it in. Same with these. This is just like more News Gothic stuff that I like. So that's kind of just like a blitz through just a fraction of my folder of cool examples of Franklin and News Gothic in use. Complete step 2 of your conversion to a Franklin monster. Let me take a sip of water here. It seems like a good time as any. Step 3 is where it really starts going off the rails, though. So as I've been growing up with Franklin Gothic and loving it and collecting all these cool examples and kind of trying to use the versions that exist and wishing that there was something else, at a certain point I decided I was just going to give up and do it myself and make my own version of Franklin Gothic. So that's what I'm doing. And it started by kind of seeing things that I liked in historical design work that I wish there was a typeface that I could do a similar thing with, but there wasn't exactly the thing that I wanted. And so this is kind of my checklist. There are a lot of different digital Franklins. I only scraped the very tip of the surface with ITC Franklin. There's a version from URW, there's a version I think from Elsner and Flocka. There are all these. Them seem to be based, or at least referencing, the original ITC Franklin and ITC Franklin Gothic. But this is my checklist of things that I would want from my ideal version of Franklin Gothic, and none of them check all of the boxes, which is why I decided, okay, I'm just going to do it myself. I'm not going to read these out loud to you, but I'll explain most of the things as we go through. I should say, before I go on though, that there are some digital typefaces that are based on either Franklin Gothic or News Gothic that are quite good and recommendable. Usually the reasons that I wouldn't use them, or that it wasn't enough that I had to make my own version, is because a lot of them kind of miss that original Franklin Gothic feeling, which I really hold dear to my heart. Probably the most prominent example I can think of is Benton Sands. Benton Sands is a great typeface. It's a really great typeface. I've used it before, and it is very usable, very flexible. There's a bunch of weights, a bunch of widths. The weights and widths are spaced in very practical ways. And it's no surprise that it's related to Franklin Gothic, because the designer Tobias Farrar-Jones started with News Gothic as kind of the beginning, and of course probably looked at all the other ATF Gothics as he was working on it. But you can really see it in the lighter weights. It has a lot of a News Gothic kind of look to it. But when it gets into the really heavy weights, I think that's actually, it's really cool. It's not Franklin Gothic, but it's its own thing, and I really appreciate that, and I like it. Christian Schwartz, who I mentioned earlier, his company Commercial Type worked on a custom version of Franklin Gothic for MoMA, which is also quite nice. It's slightly more regularized. It's got like kind of a moving more in a Helvetica-ish direction. Things are starting to kind of close up more like Helvetica might, but it sets really well from everything I've seen. Unfortunately, it's an exclusive design, so if I wanted to use it for something, I just couldn't, so that's kind of a non-starter. Same thing with New York Times. I'm sorry I didn't get a good example of showing. They have a custom version of their own New York Times Franklin, which it was designed, at least in part, by Matthew Carter, and it's quite nice, especially the way they use it in some of their infographics and things like that. I'm sorry to my friend Rumsey, who works there, and I've talked to about Franklin Gothic quite a bit, that I didn't have a better slide to represent your usage here, but I'll make it up to you one day. But again, New York Times Franklin, as you might imagine, is not something I can license and use for my own projects, so that kind of cuts it out. I should also say, as you've heard me talk about the extra condensed width of Franklin Gothic, is probably at the top of the list of things I would need for any kind of Franklin-esque typeface to be, to check all the boxes that I need. So another example is this typeface Balto, which again, is a really great typeface. I especially like the ultra weights and the thin weight. It has a lot of the same kind of American Gothic flavor as Franklin Gothic. It's a little further removed than something like Benton Sands, but it's in the same kind of general universe, and it's really well made. I'm still trying to find an excuse to use that for something. Unfortunately, as far as I know, there's not a condensed variant, or if there is, it's not on the website of Type Supply, but yeah, another great typeface. Finally, there's this company that is basically taken up the trademarks of the American Type Founder Company, and have kind of restarted the American Type Founders Collection, I think it's called. And they have their own version of Franklin Gothic, which is definitely in the same kind of realm as Franklin Gothic, and I think it's also very well made. My only issue with this, well, again, it doesn't have that extra condensed width that I really like, and it's slightly far removed from Franklin Gothic. And probably any of you looking at this slide are saying, what are you talking about? That's just Franklin Gothic. But the ear on the G is a little bit too enthusiastic for me, and it's just slightly wide. I would prefer like a more of a narrow option. All the people that made these typefaces are my friends, so I hope they're not going to hate me for critiquing their work publicly. So this is X Franklin, which is the project that I'm working on. And it's basically, as you might imagine, kind of checks all the boxes that I showed earlier. I wanted to have a bunch of widths and weights, which it's now at least covers kind of the standard Franklin Gothic and a good chunk of Muse Gothic realm of width and weight. I've been working on an extremely condensed version, which you maybe saw at the beginning or in the promo materials for this talk. And I also have like an extremely light hairline. But this is something that I'm kind of working on gradually and selling it kind of as a work in progress through this platform called Future Fonts, which is great for a person like me who likes working on fonts sometimes, but then likes not working on fonts sometimes, and I can still sell them, and people still use them. Actually, just today, a show closed at Grand Central Terminal that was using X Franklin. It's probably the most public use of the typeface I've seen so far. But I don't want to make this like a marketing talk, but I want to like talk you through some of the ideas that I took from the stuff I showed before and brought into the design. One is this idea of multiplexing, which is essentially when the boulder weights, or basically any variant, matches the same width as another variant. So I could change the weight and it won't make a headline break onto 2 lines. Or if I decide I just want to like slightly nudge up the weight of my body text, I can do that without being worrying about everything reflowing and not having to deal with that again. I built it as a variable font, so I can really have a lot of control over like very minute changes, but even the named instances that I'm offering as kind of normal static fonts are pretty. I have a narrow version, which is just slightly narrower than the normal, and I have a medium version, which is just slightly heavier than the regular. And I don't even know if you can see the differences on this projection, but they're the kind of things that I always wish for when I'm setting type, especially when you have like white type on a dark background and you want to just like slightly tweak the weight a little bit. The other thing that's been really fun to work on and has been very much inspired by some of the examples I've been talking about and showing is this version where essentially I want to make it as easy as possible to set these very tight settings. I don't know if you've heard of TNT typography, but it comes from the era of ITC and photo lettering, and it stands for tight not touching, and it is what it sounds like. Basically the normal rules of kind of rhythm and spacing that you would typically use for body typefaces are completely out the window, and the focus is much more on getting a regular spacing between the glyphs, as you can see here. And in fact, I took the name from photo lettering, had a promotional, I think maybe a couple promotional booklets where they were promoting this like, tight type trademark service, which essentially was just them like setting the tighter. It's tight. I don't think it was anything special. It was just a way for them to like, this style was very much in fashion at the time of setting things extremely tight. And as a way for them to say like, hey, look how cool this is. Like, if you work with us, we can make your type look cool. But I also like seeing this kind of application kind of out in the real world. This is a photo from my friend David Jonathan Ross in Washington, D.C. And you see this a lot also in the numerous punk rock examples I didn't show you. There are examples that were set with letter set, and the spacing was set very tightly like this. If you have just like a vinyl letter or a rub down letter, it's much easier to really cram the letters together as tight as possible. We also had a debate about whether this sign is supposed to be read as the home of Jumbo Slice or home of the Jumbo Slice. The jury's still out on that, but I like the elevating quotation marks there. So I made this version of my Hex Franklin, which, let's see if it works here, here we go. So it's a variable font, and the concept is basically there are different sliders to adjust different kinds of spacing as well as the width. So one of the sliders just sets how tightly the spacing are. It's essentially like a tracking slider. But as you can see, some letters track at a different rate than, or some letter combinations track at a different rate. If you have two straight up and down letters, they're going to change at a different rate than if you have two, diagonal letters crashing into each other. And then there's a not touching access, which basically allows you to have the letters overlap or not overlap, depending on your taste in this very tight typesetting thing. I should mention that this is, as you can see, it's just the extra bold weight. This is like for display uses only. There is lowercase, but it's nice because when you have this really tight spacing built into the font, you can do stuff like make websites with these extremely tight headlines, and you don't have to do any kerning. It's like artificial intelligence built into the font to deal with those issues for you. So this headline, I just set this. I didn't kern this at all. I just set it and tightened the spacing. And it's really fun. It's really tedious to get it to work the way I want it to work. But it's fun to think about making a typeface that's normally, usually if you're making a kind of standard sans serif like Franklin Gothic, you try to make it as versatile as possible, and you want it to work for small sizes and large sizes. But the idea of just throwing that all out the window and having this tight version, which is a completely separate font file, and then putting in all the bells and whistles that are specific to very large, very tight display typography. This is another example, like I just typed this, and that's how it's set. And again, like this isn't the way I would recommend like a student of type design to make their first typeface, though some of them are inclined to do that. But it also required a little bit of trickery on my end to get, normally the side of the A and the side of the W don't always match up like perfectly like that. Like either the W is wider or the A is narrower. So I had to kind of do some fudging within the typeface itself. But I think it works well enough, especially in these contexts where you really see if one of them was a slightly different angle, you would notice, and it would, at least that's the kind of thing that to me is like having a pebble in my shoes when you see that slightly off thing. You may recognize this from one of the book covers I showed. I wanted to just build in these gigantic quotation marks. So these are glyphs in the typeface, and they have a Unicode value for the quotation mark ornament, and you just type them, and that's how they type out. You don't have to scale them up and change the baseline and deal with stuff like that if you want to have kind of cool, big, chunky quotes. Similarly, this is like a very small, very display-centric issue, but the standard design of Hex Franklin, the punctuation is larger than the horizontal strokes in the letters, which is pretty typical for most typeface design. But if you're setting these gigantic extra tight headlines, to me, I always like when things line up, especially when you have all this like very rigid, very closely spaced stuff. So I have a stylistic set that you can just turn on, and again, like no kerning or messing around with baseline and sizing, and it just snaps everything to line up the way that you want. And of course, when you're setting lines that are this tight, as one is to do with extra large Franklin Gothic. Sometimes the punctuation can be an issue. So again, I made another stylistic set that basically just bumps it up, and you don't have to mess with baselines and whatever else, and it's all like very accurately aligned. So this is the type version of Hex Franklin, which has been really fun to work on, and it's been really fun to use. There's a few other bells and whistles that I'll just go through real quickly. Some of the alternates that I saw in that alphabet showing with the different versions of different letters, I'm starting to build in. So this is like an alternate lowercase g. I think I have an alternate lowercase a as well that's kind of a similar structure. But this is something that I'm just still continue to work on. You can buy it now if you want. It's now, I've updated it I think 2 or 3 times, so it's not as cheap as if you had gotten in on the ground floor, but if you buy a license now, whatever updates I do in the future you get for free. That's one of the nice things about future fonts. The other thing that's been really fun about, and probably has been motivating most of my work about working on this project, is basically using it to try to recreate all the cool designs that I see, but make them a little more tight, or put my own little spin on them. So some of these you may recognize from the stuff that I showed. Some of them are other things that I didn't manage to get in the slides with the time I have. So it's just been really fun to use it, especially that tight version, which I used for the flyer for this talk, which I also made printed flyers out of. There's a stack here if you want to take some home. This is one of the flyers hanging down the street from my house. And with that, you have completed your transformation into a Franklin Gothic monster, and that is the end of my talk. Do you want to do questions?
Yeah, I think we have like maybe a couple minutes.
Okay.
So we should let the staff go with we'll take a few.
Great talk. Do you have any plans on adding some foreign letters, like French, Spanish letters with the little squiggles?
I have already done that, actually. At least for, so the